What is rent control or rent stabilization? When the government controls the amount of rent that may be charged by a housing provider.
Why is rent control bad for housing? Because if prices on rent are artificially controlled, this leads to less housing. Housing relies on private investors and builders to become a reality in communities throughout the country. Controlling the price of housing reduces the incentives to build or to become a housing provider, and to continuously be a housing provider with the ever-increasing maintenance and operation costs.
Where does rent control come from?
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
After the U.S.'s official entry into World War II at the end of 1941, the federal government implemented price control on consumer goods, and this would include the roof over people's heads. So while rent was controlled, so was the price of cheese, milk, butter, if you could even get butter, rubber, steel, aluminum, coffee and sugar, oh my, gasoline, shoes, meat, even bicycles. This was all initially implemented in 1942. World War II was obviously a seismic world event, and these extreme measures were taken to help the war effort at home and abroad. After World War II, rent control was temporarily continued. This move to control prices and rent was temporary because a free market dictates the price of consumer goods, just as it dictates car prices, gas prices, mortgage rates, and yes, rent. We don't still have price control on butter and bicycles because this was discontinued after the worldwide event of World War II had passed. Can you imagine price control on bicycles? During the Nixon administration, some cities and states across the U.S. implemented rent control, such as New York City, Washington, D.C., and much of the state of Massachusetts. The problem with implementing rent control is it's very difficult to remove, and not to mention this can lead to a huge political hurdle for local elected officials. It's much easier to remove price controls on the bicycles than to remove rent control in a housing market. This caused some cities to maintain a version of the 1970s rent control into the late 1980s.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And 1990s, and some locales such as New York City, into our current time. Now, to talk about modern day rent control and how this idea stops development of new housing, which ultimately drives up rents and costs. For an example of rent control effectively removed, we go to Massachusetts. In 1994, Cambridge, Massachusetts was one of the first major cities to remove rent control after having it in place since 1971.
For 25 years, rents have been artificially suppressed, and some people had a good deal for a long time.
This was removed by a statewide initiative, removed by voters in a deep blue state like Massachusetts, the progressive homeland of the Kennedy family.
But it was a gradual process, but it was from the time that it was put back in I guess 1971, till its repeal, that it changed who it served. It ended up subsidizing the lifestyles of
the rich and famous.
After the removal of rent control, Cambridge saw a 20% increase in new development and a large source of increased revenue from the $2 billion rise in property values between 1994 and 2004. New York City. This rent control policy's intent was to help lower-income individuals with the high prices of the city. The exact opposite has come to pass, with those benefiting most being white, privileged, and wealthy individuals and families.
I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in a 2-bedroom apartment, and I pay $1,300 a month in rent.
That is the New York rent-controlled price for her apartment.
But I didn't like my apartment. I didn't think it was nice, and I maybe in my naive mind thought that I would be able to afford something nicer. This exact apartment, a couple floors up, went 2 years ago, I believe, for $38, maybe $36, but around that range.
A similar apartment in the Upper West Side in Manhattan can rent between $5,000 and $7,000 a month. Rent-controlled apartments are passed down to younger generations and lead to affluent renters living in units that they otherwise would not economically qualify for. The former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, was a wealthy and politically powerful man, and he lived in a rent-controlled apartment while serving as mayor for one of the biggest cities in the world. This type of system of rent control leaves no vacant units for others trying to move up and start their lives or start a family, and this is referred to as down renting. When a more affluent individual or family rents an apartment that would be affordable to middle-income families, then the middle-income family can't find a unit and they rent a unit meant for low-income individuals. This leaves no available units for low-income individuals. the options become even lower when considering.
Here is what an apartment can look like when a tenant moves out of a rent-stabilized apartment after living here for nearly 30 years. At the time, this apartment went for $775 per month. For a full year, it sat vacant because the landlord says it needs $50,000 worth of renovations just to bring it up to code. Since 2019, many such renovations have been unaffordable for landlords because of a New York law that caps rent-stabilized increases at 3%.
So, two major cities with demonstrated failure of rent control. This can be illustrated again in San Francisco, where rent control was expanded in 1994 instead of repealed as in Cambridge's case. A 2018 study out of Stanford University found that with the expansion of rent control in San Francisco in the mid-90s, this ultimately led to 15% less rental supply of small multifamily housing. I mean, why do you think Danny Tanner has his entire extended family living in his Victorian townhouse? The rental housing stock left was renovated to rent for more money, and most new construction was catered towards the higher income tech bro cast. The outcomes of rent control have greatly contributed to gentrification and income inequality in the city by the Bay. Even in the face of multiple major cities' failure with rent control, as well as study after study after study after study, showing rent control as bad policy, it is still being peddled by extreme progressives across the country.
Believe now we know this can be done. You're going to see this happening in states all across the country.
This was one of the follow the science or trust the science governors, right? Remember the big line?
Science, or public health, not politics, must be the guide.
Well, I trust science.
Economics is science, so follow the economic science about rent control. To follow the science from San Francisco, in 2019, California implemented a statewide cap of 5% plus regional inflation. This is similar to the approach of Oregon. So despite the clear track record of New York, Cambridge, San Francisco, Oregon still chose to not trust the science and implement rent control. We spoke to George McCleary, a local property developer in Portland, to hear the impacts of Oregon's rent control on the state's biggest metropolitan area.
So because all of those units are getting taken out of the rental pool, where are they going? They're being sold on the retail market to homeowners, which decreases the supply of rentals and leads to higher rents. If you talk to any national developer, they're going to build in places with population growth and with favorable market conditions for rentals. And they don't want to do it in places like Portland for those exact reasons. And so our housing supply remains constricted, rents remain high, and ultimately the tenant ends up paying the price.
Now to bring the subject back home to Washington. In Washington, rent control is illegal. Despite clear data from other cities and states, elected officials are still actively working to implement similar rent control policies. Remember the studies I talked about earlier? Well, rent control is still being peddled in our region.
We have a powerful example from multiple states to follow, and I have no doubt in my mind that we will be able to win a historic victory in Seattle as well.
Well, due to the quote success discussed by former Seattle Councilmember Shama Sawant, housing providers are leaving Seattle due to the overburdensome regulation. Most small rental housing providers live in the communities where they own rentals, and they provide much of the affordable rental housing. Their rents are usually well below fair market rent, and because of increasingly onerous policies, they are choosing to no longer be housing providers. We need more housing, not less. Many policies regarding rental housing have passed in Seattle over the last number of years, and according to a 2023 Seattle City Audit Report, Seattle lost nearly 7,000 single-family rental units between 2019 and 2023. Why did we lose many of these units? We spoke to Morgan Shook of Echo Northwest to get his take.
Right, there's a survey analysis that says, well, why did you guys leave? And here, I think, I would call this far from settled, but there's a lot of evidence here when people were self-reporting as actual sort of small providers of rental housing that suggests that the complexity and burden of complying with these rules been the main source of that.
We have a severe rental housing shortage in Washington, and the only way to remedy this situation is not only to build more affordable rental housing, but also to keep the rental housing already available. With new regulations, the available rental unit count comes down and costs go up. Despite all the evidence, rent control is still being discussed.
Bills making their way through the state legislature, and that does include a bill that limits rent increases in Washington.
Lawmakers are going to discuss what they can do about rent prices in our state. The Housing Committee is going to hear 2 proposals on rent control.
What do you think will happen if Washington passes rent control? Rent control and other restrictive policies will only lead to less housing available, and in turn will lead to rising costs for already struggling tenants in Washington state. So to follow the science and evidence, science has proven the concept of gravity and the existence of dinosaurs. We believe in these ideas because we trust information from scientists and economists. If we didn't, we might still believe the world is flat. So trust the science of rent control as well. Science says rent control is a bad idea because when implemented, rents go up and available unit count goes down. Anywhere rent control has been tried, it has failed. For more information about the harmful impacts of rent control on local housing, please reach out to the Rental Housing Association of Washington's Government Affairs team. Rent control kills housing.